Hello everybody. In this video I'm going to cover the major issues with the DJI Phantom 4 Pro camera and my recommended settings to get the best video from it. In addition, I cover some other factors that can affect the quality of video, including calibrations, flying technique, location, time of day, and weather. Lastly, I'll cover some of the safety and rules we should be aware of and adhere to, bearing in mind that there are variations in rules in other parts of the world. So, first let's talk about the problems with the P4p camera and the effect that has on your video. The Phantom 4 Pro camera is an 8-bit camera, and it therefore has a pretty limited dynamic range. Now that isn't to say you can't get good or even great video from it. Rather, it points out that it will do better when conditions permit, but not so well when conditions are less desirable. A limited dynamic range will reduce your ability to make contrast adjustments in post, but perhaps the single biggest shortcoming of the 8-bit camera is a tendency to produce banding in a featureless sky. No matter what settings you use, if the sky is featureless, you will see banding, and that banding can be worse with certain settings like D-Log. I'll talk more about D-Log later in the video. Another factor is the image processing chip and the firmware that does the image processing. This is an area that DJI could improve on, as their coding skills are not quite at the Google or Apple level. I would really like to see them put more emphasis on first-rate coding. One of the problems I get almost every flight, and often several times per flight, is a tearing of the video that often occurs at or just after a file boundary. It should be noted that when you are recording video with the P4p, that once the current file size reaches about 4 gigabytes, it closes that file and opens another one. And it's my belief that the overhead to do that while continuing to record video, particularly 4K video, is more than the image processing chip and or the image processing firmware can handle comfortably. This tearing issue, though most frequently at a file boundary, is not limited to file boundaries, and I've seen this tearing problem occur in the middle of a file. So here's a few clips that demonstrate the banding and image tearing problem. Alright, here's a shot, or a sequence shot using D-Log, and you can see substantial banding in the sky. This is a shot right there. You see the tearing in the video. That occurred at the end of a file boundary. And there, the tearing occurred in the middle of a file. So, in summary, the main limitations of the camera are that it is 8-bit with limited dynamic range and a high probability of banding, and that the image processing hardware and or software is marginal, resulting in frequent tearing problems in the video and log profiles that aren't very good. On to camera settings now. So, I hope that the first part of this video hasn't convinced you that the camera in the Phantom 4 Pro is garbage, and I will highlight some examples that show that the camera can indeed produce some spectacular video. The trick is to use the right settings and develop the flying skills to maximize its best qualities while minimizing its worst. The following clip should give you an idea of what can be achieved with the right settings. This is a scene shot in the abandoned town or ghost town of Perea, Utah. And this is looking up the upstream of the Perea River channel, dry at this time. That's a gorgeous scene. The striped chocolate colors and the like. And then panning to look in the other direction, downstream of the Perea River. And this is the toadstool hoodoos, also in Utah, and actually only about 15 miles away from where Perea is. This is actually an easy half-a-mile hike from the road. Really cool place. And this is also from the Toadstool Hoodoo area, a bit north and west of where we just were. Some of the canyons that most of the people who come to this area are completely unfamiliar with. Don't even know this is here. Okay, now that you've had a chance to see that the P4p can produce good results, let's talk in detail about the settings I used to achieve that. Let me fire up the drone, remote, and Go4 app, and we'll walk through the settings. Alright, so here's the main menu or main display of the Go4 app when you bring it up. I'm indoors right now. I don't have any props on the drone. Drone is on, but I don't have any props on it. So in any case, what we're going to be concentrating on is the camera settings. And let's kind of review what the display shows you. At the top section here, just below the top actually, you see the ISO is listed as 100. The shutter speed at 1/30 or 1/30th of a second. The F number at f5.6, and the MM is referring to basically the EV value, and it's showing basically that it's underexposed by about 2 stops. The color profile is D-Cine-like. The white balance is set to custom at 5700 Kelvin. The video mode is set to 4K 30 frames per second, and the capacity is showing as about 2 hours and 50 minutes of recording time. I have it in automatic focus control, and over here we show the symbol for the type of camera. You can be shooting either video or still pictures. Right now it's showing video camera. If I touch that, it changes to camera, or still camera I should say. So we'll go back to video. That's the record, start, stop button. And this here is your settings control menu. So let's go into that. Again, remember we're in video mode at the moment. So let's go into settings. Go to the first button there. And this is where you set up sort of the main features of how you want the camera to operate. I currently have it showing as in manual exposure control. You could select automatic, and you can see how the screen kind of brightened up. ISO went to 200. You could change to aperture priority, in which case the aperture is fixed at some value, and then the camera automatically changes the shutter speed or ISO according to how it determines to get the proper exposure. S refers to shutter priority, where you basically set the shutter speed, and then the camera determines what the appropriate aperture and ISO setting would be to get the correct exposure. But again, I recommend, if you're going to be serious about this, go into manual, because any of the other modes, the camera is going to change your settings on you as you're flying, and that's not always desirable. Okay? In fact, it's seldom desirable. So I would recommend manual mode. And at the moment I have it in ISO 100, aperture at f5.6, shutter speed at 1/30th of a second, and again it's showing about 2 stops below or underexposed. So again, we have the toggle between video camera, where it's in now, and still camera. And if you see, the second tab over shows the video camera symbol. If I switch to still camera, See how it changes to a sort of a still camera view, looking like a DSLR? We'll come back to that in a few minutes, but let's go back to video. So let's go to that tab, and this is where you set some of the sort of deeper video settings. And the first one is video size, and that's basically your resolution, so we'll tab into that. And you have various options, full 4K, which is the 4096 by 2160. I prefer the UHD version of 4K, which is the 3840 by 2160, and I have that currently set to 30 frames per second. You can change to 2.7K or HD video at 1080 or 720p resolutions. But again, I normally have it at, almost always frankly, at UHD resolution, 3840 by 2160, and 30 frames per second. So let's step back out of there. Next is the video format, basically the file container for the compressed video. And the two options are MOV and MP4. If you're a Apple-based system, you know, using Apple computers, you probably want to use MOV. But if you're Windows-based, as I am, you're better off using MP4. In fact, many Windows PCs, if you try to use an MOV file, if that's what you set it up and you recorded it as an MOV, the nonlinear editor, your Premiere Pro or whatever, would puke on the MOV file. So you'd have to basically rename it. And renaming it is all you really have to do. Just change it from a .mov to a .mp4, and you should be good to go. Next one down is Ntsc or PAL, and it really depends on what country you're in. In the USA, where I am, Ntsc is the standard, but you can choose PAL, of course. White balance. Now this is one that has a number of options. You could choose auto, cloudy, sunny, incandescent, neon, or custom. A lot of people are going to use auto white balance, and that's okay. I'm not going to badmouth it, but I would prefer fixing it at a fixed value. And generally for me, I use a custom value, and then I set the temperature to 5700 Kelvin. And if that's off a little bit, I can adjust that in post without a problem. The thing is, by locking it, it's not going to change as you're recording. So I prefer setting that to the custom setting with 5700K or thereabouts. And again, that freezes the white balance so it doesn't change while you're recording. Let's step back out of there. Next is style, which is kind of an odd name for this, but tap that again. And what that's giving you is the ability to adjust the contrast, the saturation, contrast, and sharpening. And in my view, your best bet is to go with either -1, 0, -1, or -2, 0, -2, or any combination of those values. You want to be below 0, but you don't want to go much below -2. Your sharpening and your saturation are going to be reduced below 0, but generally between -1 and -2. And the reason for that is if you allow it to be higher than that, the camera is going to do basically to add synthetic detail to the image file, which requires the compressor to do more work to compress that video, which means less of the video bandwidth is available for actual detail. So by turning that down, you're not adding synthetic detail at this stage, allowing the compressor to make use of the limited bandwidth to compress the actual detail and not synthetic detail. So my recommendation, -1, 0, -1, 2, -2, 0, -2. Those would be the range I would suggest. Next is color profile, and this is one that gets a lot of people. a lot of people assume that, hey, the pros all say you got to use D-log or some form of log profile. The problem is we're not in a studio. We're outdoors, so you don't have control over your lighting and background. And I'll go into more of that in detail in the technical portion of this. So, in any case, I use Ntsc almost all the time, and that would be the one I would recommend you use. It doesn't distort the compression like D-log does, and it doesn't make it harder to see the display while flying like D-log does. So Ntsc is the one I would recommend. Next one down is the encoding format, and this is another area where there's going to be some options. The two options you have are H.264 and the newer H.265. Now, H.265 is a more efficient codec that will allow a given bandwidth to code greater detail. The problem is it's a really CPU intensive codec. If you have an older PC or a PC that's not terribly powerful, you're probably better off going with H.264. I have a fairly powerful PC, so I tend to go with H.265. I still have issues with viewing the video files on my Windows PC. The Premiere Pro handles it okay, but it's at this point we're kind of on the cusp of having newer PCs with newer GPUs and CPUs that are capable of handling H.265 natively, but we're sort of not quite there yet. So if your PC is having some difficulties handling it, you probably ought to select H.264. I choose H.265 because I'm willing to live with it. So that's the second tab. If we go to the camera, select the still camera, notice that second tab changes to the still picture option. So we'll go in there real quickly. I'm not going to spend too much time on the still picture aspects of this because we're really concentrating on the video, but let's go through this really quickly. So first option is photo, and that's single shot burst, that kind of deal. I'm using single shot. Image ratio, that's the aspect ratio. You can choose 4:3, which will give you the largest number of pixels. 16:9 gives you the widest format, and 3:2 is typical of what a digital SLR would use. Again, I'm using 16:9 because that matches the video format. Now the image format I have as RAW. You can have it as RAW, JPEG, or JPEG and RAW. I choose RAW. And again, the white balance, we talked about that a bit before. And again, I have that set at 5700 Kelvin. Color, again, Ntsc. So we really don't need to go any further on that. We've covered the still photo menu, so let's go back to video camera. And now we're going to go to the final tab here, which is the main settings, or additional settings, I should say. So in here I have the histogram set to on, the green with the button over to the right that says it's on. The lock gimbal while shooting is on. Automatic focus control is on. Video captions I have off. Overexposure warning is off. Mechanical shutter is on. AF focus assistant is off. Manual focus assistant is off. Front LEDs auto turn off I have on. Grid, you have a couple of options there. I choose the grid lines, just basically the grid lines. You can choose off the basically 2x2 grid lines, or the grid lines with diagonals. I choose just the regular grid lines. Center point, that's this target right here. So I have that as the standard center point, and you have a few other options. I'm not going to go through them, but bottom line is that's what I have. Focus, peaking, threshold. I have to close, and you can have high, standard, low, or close. That's the options. File index mode is reset. Currently I have it to reset, and the other one would be continuous. And in the continuous, it's going to just keep indexing the file name. With reset, every time you reformat the card, so there are no image files on it, it's going to start with file number, was it DJI underscore 0001, something like that. In any case, I have it at reset. It really is up to you to choose on that. And then camera settings. This is more or less like saving a bunch of, 4 different custom settings for the camera. I don't really use that because I have basically a set of the setup that I use all the time, and I don't really change that. Then you can do reset camera settings, which is basically going to put it back to the default settings. And then finally you have format SD card, which you would do, which you should do every time you put the card back in the camera, back in the drone. You fly, you take some pictures, you shoot some video, you upload them to your PC, you delete them from the card, put the card back into the drone, and then reformat it every time. It just makes sure that you don't screw up your file formats on the card. So that's the, and just hit that again to clear it. And we're not really set up to do this, but tap the focus. Basically you're gonna, yeah, we can't really see anything here. Let me see if I can turn this drone so that it can see something to focus on. Kind of dark, but let's try here. Not bright enough. Let's see. If I do this, if I go to auto mode, that'll brighten things up. That'll make it easier to see it. And now if I do a tap to focus, you see that? So you tap on an object. That didn't see it very well, so try here. And that tells you that you've got a focus. And what I recommend doing is once you take off and you get 30, 40, 50 feet in the air, find an object that has a good contrast on it so that the camera is pretty sure to be able to see it and be able to focus on it. And choose a distance that's roughly a third of the way out in the range that you want to be able to photograph. So if you're looking from 50 to a couple of thousand feet, tap on something maybe 600 feet away, roughly. I mean, this is an approximation. You're probably going to be at infinity focus beyond about 100 feet anyway, but that's kind of the rule of thumb in photography. Focus about a third of the way into the depth of field you want to cover. So that's that. And again, to start recording, you press the red button, and to stop it, you press the red button. Okay, let's review that again. My first recommendation is to use manual exposure control, and to do so every flight. This will take some time to learn if you have no experience with manual exposure control, but the results are worth the effort. So select manual exposure control from the Go4 app. Beginning at the top of the camera settings menu, I use manual exposure control, so I select the M button for manual. The other options are auto for automatic exposure control, A for aperture priority, which locks the aperture but lets the camera select a different ISO and shutter speed, and S for shutter priority, which locks the shutter speed but lets the camera select a different ISO and aperture. Below that, you can change the sensitivity. I usually leave it at ISO 100. Next we have aperture, and I'd recommend keeping that between f4 and f6.3. and I usually use f5.6. Going above f6.3 will result in less detail due to diffraction limiting, while going less than f4 could result in blurring due to reduced depth of field. Next is the shutter speed, and it is the knob that I usually use to control exposure. With my other settings set at ISO 100 and f5.6, the shutter speed will vary, depending on lighting levels, between about 1/400 and 1/2000, with 1/1000th of a second, 1/1000, being the most common setting. You can use neutral density filters to lower the shutter speed, but I've not found that to be necessary. The next tab over, the video settings, adjust the video settings as follows. First, the video size, and you can choose 4K, 2.7K, HD, 1080, 720. I invariably use 4K 30, and that's actually the 4K UHD, or 3840 by 2160, and 30 frames per second. If I need to use a different level of video in post, I can downsample as necessary in post. Video format, MP4 or MOV. I'm Windows based, so MP4 is the best choice. Ntsc PAL, depending on where you are in the world. I'm in the USA, so that's Ntsc. White balance, I have set to custom and usually around about 5700 Kelvin. In my case, there are other options available, and that's up to you. Style, a little misleading name, but this is where you can make sort of compensations in your saturation, contrast, and sharpening. And I usually use a custom setting of -1, 0, -1, or -2, 0, -2. Somewhere's in there, so that this reduces saturation and sharpening that happens in camera. If you leave this at zeros, or worse, you boost them above 0, then you're providing the compressor, the video compressor, synthetic detail that it will have to waste data on that is better done in post. Reducing these values a bit should allow the compressor to have more data space to code the actual detail and not waste it on synthetic detail. Next item, color. Again, I use Ntsc as a choice that I use. There are other options, none, D-Log, and a few others. In my opinion, the two best options are none and D-Log, and the two best options are none and Ntsc, and I use Ntsc. I find it works best for me. The encoding format, this is the actual codec that's used to compress the video. The two options are H.265 or H.264. Now, I use H.265 as it should record more detail more efficiently, permitting the limited 100 megabits per second data rate to record more detail. But H.265 can be a bear to work with, and if you don't have a powerful PC for editing, you're probably better off using H.264. So again, I recommend ISO 100 where possible, most of the time, Aperture f5.6. In manual exposure control with the ISO and Aperture set, the only other knobs available to control exposure are neutral density filters and adjusting the shutter speed. It's often recommended to keep the shutter speed around 2x the frame rate, so that for a frame rate of 30 frames per second, the shutter speed should be around 1/60th of a second. So with the Aperture and ISO set as above, the shutter speed without neutral density filters would tend to fall within a range of about 1/400 to 1/2000, depending on clouds and time of day, with 1/1000th of a second being typical for a normal sunny day. So, to get a shutter speed around 1/60th of a second, when the conditions would otherwise demand a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, would require a 4-stop neutral density filter to bring the shutter speed down to about 1/60. I should add that in my experience, a neutral density filter is optional, and in fact, I seldom use one. In my experience, the video I get is very good, even when the shutter speed is above 1/2000. The consequence of higher shutter speed tends to be sharper video with more detail, though it can exaggerate stuttering somewhat, particularly if there are close objects with panning and yawning. You saw a few clips earlier that show how good the video can be, and I have links to more complete videos that you may wish to look at after this video. In all those clips and full videos listed below, I do not use neutral density filters at all. I think you'll see that the need for ND filters isn't quite as important for drone videos as it might be for studio work or when shooting high-speed objects like race cars. Again, you can choose MP4 MOV as the file container. If you're a Mac person, MOV is probably the way to go. Otherwise, stick with MP4. Again, I shoot 4K UHD, 3840 by 2160 at 30 frames per second. You may be tempted to use 24 frames per second or 25 frames per second if you're PAL, but I would argue against those frame rates as aerial video reveals a stuttering effect more noticeably than other videos. And this is an area where people differ, and I may well be more sensitive to stuttering than most, but in my experience, 30 frames per second is the best compromise at this time. Perhaps a few years from now, when data rates are in the 200 megabits per second range and image processing hardware is more capable, a higher frame rate would be useful, but at this point, stay with 30 frames per second. Now to the part of the discussion that I'm sure will result in a lot of feedback. Color profiles. Many serious videographers choose to use some form of log profile, and many others use it because that's what they hear they should be using. In the case of the Phantom 4 Pro, that's D-Log. Like many, I tried to make D-Log work, but after many attempts, I gave up and have instead chosen D-Cine-like as my profile of choice. In the year since I received my P4p, DJI has changed the color profiles numerous times and often substantially. D-Log in particular has seen massive changes in many of its updates. My problem with D-Log is basically two things. First, D-Log allocates more of the levels, more of the dynamic range to the midtones, and that leaves fewer levels, less dynamic range, for the highlights and shadows. In studio work, this is often desirable as the midtones are where people's skin tones fall most of the time, and having more control of that is desirable. But in a studio, you usually have control over lighting and, significantly, the background. If you can control the lighting and background, you can pretty much eliminate banding, even with an 8-bit camera. But for us drone pilots, flying and shooting outdoors, we do not have that level of control of lighting or background. It is what it is. With an 8-bit camera like the P4p, you are already marginal for banding, so reducing the levels to code the highlights, as D-Log does, makes banding worse. You can get banding in shadow areas as well, but often there's a lot more detail in the shadows that break up the banding, so it tends to be less noticeable. The conditions that reveal the worst banding problem is mostly featureless sky that has limited color and luminance differences across a large swath of the field of view. If, however, you have a detailed sky with nice clouds with varying density, banding will be far less of a problem and often completely unnoticeable. The second problem I have with D-Log is that it makes setting the exposure much harder, and for several reasons. First, the histogram is altered in such a way that what appears to be well exposed may in fact be several stops overexposed. The histogram is useless in D-Log, in my opinion. Secondly, the video presented on the Go 4 app screen is much more washed out when using D-Log, so it's harder to visually confirm in the video feed if the exposure is correct. This has the additional problem of making it harder to see what's going on while flying, as the screen is more washed out. Remember that we are flying outdoors and in the sun, so seeing a tablet or phone is hard to begin with. Making the image more washed out makes it that much harder. So I would recommend staying away from D-Log, and in my case, I use D-Cinelike. I would also recommend using a style or compensation of either -1 or -2 for sharpness and -1 or -2 for saturation. Just to clear up what the icons in the style menu mean, the first icon, a triangle, is the adjustment for sharpness. The second icon, a circle that's white on one side and black on the others, is for contrast adjustment. And lastly, the third icon, a rectangle that fades from white in the upper left to black in the lower right, is the adjustment for saturation. Some other settings and techniques. In addition to the actual camera settings, there are a few other things that can affect the quality of video you record with the P4p. Among the biggest complaints is the tilted horizon issue. And although the newer drones, like the P4p, are better at this, it can still be a problem. Getting a level horizon begins with a good IMU and gimbal calibration. Do this on a hard surface like concrete and try to find a place that is as close to dead level as possible. I made up a leveling board that I place on the concrete surface, then level before beginning the calibrations. And remember, when performing the IMU calibration, do not move around or have loud noises, as any vibration can affect the calibration. Getting a good IMU and gimbal calibration is important, but only part of the equation, with flying technique often being as important or even more important. If you're just flying around to have fun, go ahead and jerk the sticks around as you please. But if you want good video and a level horizon, you need to go easy on the sticks. Being a fighter pilot and an aerial videographer are mutually exclusive occupations. Being easy on the sticks is also important to get good video that people want to watch. Ignoring the level horizon issue for the moment, when you jerk the sticks around, the video will be jerky, and that's seldom a good thing. Related to that is going easy on the camera tilting. It may be tempting to tilt up and down, but keep that to a minimum. One last thing on camera tilting. Some pilots like to tilt the camera down and leave it down while flying, and I'd warn you that doing so can make some of your viewers nauseous due to a motion sickness-like effect. I can't stress how important it is to go easy on the sticks and camera tilting. Try both ways yourself and review the video. Another thing that can have an adverse effect on your video is being twitchy. You know, that nervousness that you often have after 3 cups of coffee. If your hands are shaky, your video will be shaky. It's useful to the point of necessity that you survey the location before you fly. I can tell from personal experience that if you rush things and fail to properly review the location, you can get into real difficulties. A couple of years ago, I had planned to be at a location just before sunset, but was a bit late getting there. And as the sun was dipping low in the sky, I raced to get the drone ready and failed to note the obstacles that I might face. During that flight, a flight that lasted only about 5 minutes and 44 seconds, I had one close call, one really close call, and an impact with a tree. Now, I managed to get the drone back home without crashing into the ground, but I was lucky. See link in the notes for a video called Close Call. In addition to the safety aspect of reviewing the location before flying, it's useful to have an idea of where you are going to fly and how to approach it from a visual perspective. As with still photography and other types of video work, knowing where the sun is relative to the scene you want to shoot is critical. You generally do not want to be flying towards the sun, as that will tend to induce flaring and reduce contrast. But as with almost all rules of photography, there are exceptions. And even when flying, when you are 30 degrees away from the sun, you can get a visual beat pattern due to the sunlight shining through a prop and strobing the camera lens. So knowing the time of day that the sun will be in the best position is very useful, and using a tool like Google Earth to preview the scene can be a great help to determine the best time of day to fly at a location. Weather is of course an important consideration and can have a huge impact on the quality of video you record. First, these are not waterproof machines, and flying in rain is not a good idea. A light mist may be okay, but in addition to the concern that wetting the electronics should give you, the lens of the camera is likely to either fog up or be spotted with droplets. So avoid rain. But, and this is something a pro photographer and videographer knows, overcast and cloudy days can provide terrific drama in the sky that turns an otherwise average shot into gold. Often the best visual opportunities occur within a few hours before or after a storm. In addition to providing drama, brooding clouds also greatly reduces the banding issue by increasing the detail in the sky and thus breaking up the tendency for banding. Wind. Let me tell you about wind. It's really amazing how well these little drones handle wind, but there are limits you should be aware of. Above a certain speed, you may be able to fly out, but not be able to fly back if the headwind is too strong. And at much lower wind speeds than that, it will be difficult to get stable video as the drone is trying to buck the wind, particularly so if it's gusty. Beyond the risks that flying in high wind might cause, a crash or loss of drone, or worse, hitting someone, the camera will not be able to remain as stable, and the video will suffer consequently. Safety and rules. Yes, this part. I feel it necessary to include a brief conversation about rules and safety. Many drone operators are unaware of the rules and fly in a negligent manner, not necessarily because they wish to flaunt the rules, but because they are unaware of them. There are very similar rules almost everywhere in the world, but there are regional differences, and it's up to the drone pilot to research their country's rules and abide them. The first time a drone impacts a plane or helicopter, resulting in loss of life, may see draconian rules forced upon us. Don't be that guy. Here in the USA and other places as well, you are supposed to stay below 400 feet above ground level, or 400 AGL. This elevation is relative to the takeoff location, so knowing how the ground slopes up or down as you fly must be considered. Another rule that varies somewhat around the world is that you must maintain eyesight of the drone always. We can be tempted to see how far you can fly, but a strict adherence to the rules would limit the distance to perhaps half a mile, more or less. I would add that where you fly is an important consideration in how far away you fly, and if the location is around town or anywhere it's likely a plane or helicopter is possible to be below 400 AGL, then it's important that you not go too far. If you can get away from built-up areas like, say, the desert, you have less chance of a plane or helicopter, but though the chance is less, it's not zero. In fact, it's legal for a pilot of a plane to fly below 500 AGL so long as it's not over people or things and is in a more remote location. I have a video shot in just such a remote location where I had an encounter with a small plane flying well below the normal 500-foot limit. See link for the video called DJI Phantom 4 Pro, New Firmware and Close Encounter. Another rule is to avoid flying over people, particularly groups of people. This rule also applies to animals. Do not pester wild animals. It's not nice and is very bad form. In some places around the world, there are hard rules about remaining so many meters away from any structures. So once again, you need to bone up on your country's rules. Among the most important rules and limits is flying within an exclusion zone around airports and other structures. Like all such rules, there are exceptions, but in the USA, most airports and heliports have a 5-mile radius zone, generally centered around the midfield of the airport, and you're not permitted to fly within that zone without proper notice and agreement. In addition to airports, there are other places with no-fly zones, such as the Greater Washington, D.C. area and over major sporting events. Additionally, in the USA, and similarly in other parts of the world, it's not legal to fly within a national park. In the USA, the rule is that you cannot take off or land within a park, but that nuance makes little difference. The fines for violations can be more than some people earn in a month, so it's best not to risk it. Of the other hazards you are likely to face while flying your drone, perhaps the greatest risk is power lines. The problem is that while flying, the drone is generally above the wires, so it's harder to see the wires against the background of the ground itself. Wires are easier to see against the sky. This is made even harder due to the reduced quality of video as seen on the Go4 app FPV screen. The quality of video feed is limited by the downlink bandwidth and further impacted by the increased difficulty of seeing anything on a tablet when outside in the sunlight. Again, refer to the video link called Close Call. Another risk is flying too close to communications towers, as the signal from them might interfere with control of the drone. It's not worth the risk. Finally, to assist those that are new to drones or who may otherwise be unaware, there are many tools you can use to help avoid flying where you shouldn't. In the USA, there is the FA app called Before You Fly, but it's not the best app out there. Much better is an app called AirMap, which is much better than the FAA app. Also useful are weather apps to assist with planning and go, no-go decisions. Summary. I tried to be comprehensive in this video, but no single video is going to cover everything, and there is much more to all aspects of this activity. Do try to be a good ambassador for the drone flying community, and avoid doing things that could result in death, injury, or negative press. Included in the show more area of the comments section are links to several videos, some of which I've already mentioned. Videos you may wish to look at are Close Call, that's a short video with the Inspire 1 Pro that highlights the perils of flying without properly surveying the location first. DJI Phantom 4 Pro New Firmware and Close Encounter, a video that shows the fact that even in remote areas you can encounter a low-flying aircraft. Perea Town Site by Drone in 4K is a video of the abandoned western town known as Perea. I think this video highlights the ability to get great video with the right settings. Misty Mountain and Fisher Towers near Moab in 4K is a good example of how weather conditions might affect the opportunities. Drama in the clouds, I think, make this video. That and the music. Trains at Cajon Pass by Drone in 4K. That's a video from the Cajon Pass in Southern California that highlights time of day and location. Also interesting, I think, for rail fans. DJI Phantom 4 Pro D-Log banding problem. It's just an older video that highlights some of the issues with using D-Log. And DJI Phantom 4 Pro flight and video tutorial. This is a video that goes over some of the flying techniques as well as exposure control. So these videos and others show not only what can be done with a video, but also how your videos can be informative and even teach. Okay, so that covers it, I think. So we'll end it here. Thanks for watching. Safe flying and take great video and pictures. Thanks, and have a nice day.